He had everything money could buy, but his children were afraid to live. One afternoon, he looked out the window and saw his neighbor, a woman who had lost her own twins, teaching them to ride without fear. What happened next changed that family forever. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching from. The mansion on the hill stood like a fortress of glass and stone, guarded by high iron gates and cameras that swiveled quietly at every corner. It was the sort of house that suggested its owner feared the world as much as he wanted to display his triumph over it. Inside, the silence was broken only by the soft hum of climate systems and the faint echo of steps across polished marble. For David Miller, billionaire and master of a vast technological empire, silence was more than a preference. It was control, an assurance that nothing unexpected would intrude on his carefully ordered life. Every morning followed the same pattern. He rose early, sometimes before dawn, to scan the market reports from the wall-sized screens in his office. He adjusted his schedule with the precision of an engineer fine-tuning a machine. Meals arrived on time from the kitchen staff. Meetings were slotted without overlap by his assistant. He had built his life into a predictable circuit, smooth and efficient. And yet, beneath all this order, something hollow resided. That hollowness was most visible in the way he treated his 7-year-old twins, Emma and Ethan. The children had been born into luxury, but the richness of their surroundings had not translated into warmth. They had private tutors, sports coaches, child psychologists, and a calendar more crowded than most executives. They were scheduled for violin at 10, swimming at 2, Mandarin lessons in the evening. Yet nowhere in those full days did their father's presence linger for more than a moment. He loved them, though in the way one might love a fragile investment, by protecting it, insulating it, ensuring its safety without daring to touch it too directly. Emma was the quiet one, slight of build, with dark, thoughtful eyes. She shrank from risk, clung to the side of her bicycle when asked to ride, held the rail of the staircase as though every step concealed disaster. Ethan, on the other hand, burned with energy. His blonde hair was always unruly, his knees perpetually scraped, his hunger for speed insatiable. Together, they embodied contradiction, one pulling forward, one holding back. Their father observed this like a manager analyzing opposite charts when line climbing, the other dipping, but he rarely joined in the drama of their games. Across the hedge from David's meticulously trimmed lawn lived Sarah Johnson. Her house was smaller, older, painted white with green shutters that had lost some of their shine. Her yard had once been bright with laughter, for Sarah too had twins. But a year ago, a car accident had taken both of her children. Since then, her garden had overgrown with lilacs and wild grass, as though she had surrendered it to time. 2 bicycles leaned against the fence, their chains rusted, their bells mute. On her porch hung 2 wind chimes that seldom stirred in the stillness, though neighbors whispered that when they did, Sarah stood at the window, listening with tears in her eyes. The neighborhood knew her story, but didn't know what to say. They smiled at her softly when she passed, offered casseroles at holidays, but kept their distance, for grief so raw frightened those who feared it might be contagious. Sarah retreated further into her home, speaking rarely, working little, her life narrowing to silence broken only by memory. On a bright Sunday morning, David followed his ritual. He rose, checked the cameras, scrolled through market indexes on his phone, and poured a measured cup of coffee. He wandered to his office, a vast room lined with books he never opened and glass cases displaying awards he barely remembered. As he turned toward the window, ready to take a measured glance at his property, his eyes caught motion in the driveway. He froze, His children were outside with bicycles. He had not approved such an unsupervised activity. The nanny was nowhere in sight. But what startled him more was the figure running behind the twins. It was Sarah Johnson. She wore a light blue jacket and sneakers, her hair pulled back, her face intent, yet softened by an expression of encouragement. She held the back of Ethan's bicycle seat as he wobbled, running beside him, steadying his balance. He tilted, nearly fell, and she righted him with practiced ease. Then, as the boy found his center, she let go. For a moment, Ethan pedaled forward alone, and a small bell attached to his handlebars jingled in the crisp air. Emma rode a few yards behind, her brow furrowed with concentration, her lips pressed tight. Sarah shifted her attention, running to her, whispering something David could not hear through the glass. The little girl nodded, trembling, but pushing her pedals again. Slowly, carefully, the bicycle moved. When she steadied, Sarah released her grip. Emma's bell rang too, a thin, bright note carried across the yard. For the first time in memory, David saw his children not under the stern gaze of a coach or the cautious hands of a nanny, but free, laughing, radiant with achievement. The sound of the bells, the glimmer in their eyes, the sight of their balance gained and kept, these struck him harder than any number on a report. Yet, rather than pride, his chest filled with anger. What right did Sarah have to intrude on his household? What gave her the authority to guide his children in something so personal? He felt his control undermined, his boundaries crossed. He set his coffee cup down too quickly, spilling a drop onto his desk, and stormed down the stairs toward the yard. By the time he reached the door, Ethan had managed a full circle around the driveway on his own. Emma wobbled, then steadied again, squealing with joy. Sarah clapped her hands, jogging alongside them, her face lit with an expression David had not seen in years. She looked alive, reborn for those few minutes. He stepped onto the porch, his voice caught between command and hesitation. But the children did not notice him. They were too busy racing, too busy ringing their bells, too busy smiling at Sarah. He stood there, unseen, his anger mingling with something he could not name envy, perhaps, or shame. For in that moment he recognized he had never inspired such joy in them, never seen them beam with the pure satisfaction of a small victory. That evening, after Sarah had gone back across the fence and the children were bathed and tucked into bed, David wandered through the house in silence. He passed their rooms, heard their muffled laughter, and paused at the doorway. They spoke to each other in hushed tones about how Sarah had taught them to ride, how she promised to help again, how the bells made every turn magical. He lingered, listening, realizing that for once, their excitement was not about a game on a tablet or a story from a tutor, but about something real, something they had done with their own hands and feet. He moved on to his office, the polished wood desk gleaming under the lamp. He sat heavily in the chair, staring at the screensaver on his computer. Numbers floated by, charts he normally devoured. Tonight, they blurred into irrelevance. All he could hear, in the echoing chamber of his mind, was the faint ringing of those little bicycle bells. The bells had not been meant for him, yet they pierced him more deeply than any sound he could remember. They spoke of freedom, of courage, of laughter that had no place in his meticulously ordered life. He had wanted to control everything, his company, his fortune, his home, his children. Yet in that brief morning, he had seen them happiest, when guided not by him, but by a grieving woman next door. As the night deepened, he realized the fortress he had built around his life had not only kept the world at bay, it had also locked him out of his own children's joy. The thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to wonder whether control was the same as love, or whether, in the silence of his mansion, he had mistaken one for the other. And with that, the bells kept ringing in his imagination, heralding a change he could not yet name, but which had already begun. The sound of the bells lingered in David's memory long after that Sunday morning had passed. In the days that followed, he found himself watching his children more closely, listening to the echoes of their laughter as though it were a language he had not yet learned to translate. Emma and Ethan rode their bicycles with newfound confidence, circling the driveway when they thought no one was looking, ringing their bells with such delight that even the gardeners paused in their work to smile. Yet whenever they spoke of Sarah, whenever they mentioned her patient hands and encouraging words, a tightness spread across David's chest. He told himself that his anger came from her intrusion, from the fact that she had crossed into his carefully protected world. But beneath that justification lay something far more unsettling. She had succeeded where he had failed. Sarah's house stood as a quiet contrast to his own gleaming fortress. The white paint had begun to peel, and the shutters clung stubbornly to the windows despite weathering and rusted hinges. The garden, once bright with flowers, was tangled and wild. And yet there was a warmth to it that David's immaculate lawns lacked. It was not the warmth of order, but of memory. 2 small bicycles still leaned against the fence, untouched since the accident that had taken Sarah's twins. They had been the same age as Emma and Ethan, their laughter once a familiar sound in the neighborhood. The loss had hollowed Sarah's life, and yet, in teaching his children to ride, she had stirred from her long silence. For Sarah, those mornings in the driveway had been more than a gesture of kindness. They had been an act of survival. Grief had carved deep lines into her face, had made her house a tomb of photographs and toys that would never again be used. Each evening she walked past the empty bedroom with its untouched beds, the twin posters on the wall, the little shoes still neatly arranged by the door. The bicycles, left outside to rust, were not forgotten relics, but stubborn witnesses of absence. Yet when Emma placed a new set of bright bells in her hands, asking her to make her old bicycles sing again, Sarah felt a tremor of life inside her chest, a small flame that grief had nearly extinguished. David, however, responded in the only way he knew how, with control. If Sarah could inspire his children to ride, then he would do better. He hired a professional cycling coach, a man with a background in sports science and a resume filled with Olympic references. The following weekend, the driveway was transformed into something resembling a training facility. Expensive helmets were fitted on the children's heads, each embedded with sensors to track balance and heart rate. A digital monitor displayed every wobble, every hesitation. David stood nearby, arms crossed, convinced that precision and discipline would forge confidence. But Emma trembled under the weight of the equipment. Her small hands clenched the handlebars, her eyes darting nervously to the monitor, as though afraid of failing a test she could not understand. Ethan, usually bold, grew restless under the strict instructions, pedaling too quickly, then being scolded for moving without permission. Their laughter faded, replaced by silence and frowns. What Sarah had made feel like freedom, David had turned into obligation. He noticed it, though he did not admit it. When the session ended, he praised the coach, wrote a check, and told himself that expertise justified the absence of joy. Yet that evening, from his office window, he saw his children sneak across the lawn toward the fence. Sarah was there, waiting. Without helmets or monitors, without schedules or charts, she helped them steady their bicycles again. Emma clung to her side, whispering, before daring to pedal forward. Ethan laughed, not the sharp laugh of defiance, but the pure sound of happiness. And once more, the bells rang. David's pride was pierced. He felt himself an outsider in his own children's triumphs, displaced by a woman who carried the weight of her own tragedy. He wanted to forbid it, to close the gates, to instruct the staff never to let Sarah near the children again. But he hesitated. He had seen Emma, shy and cautious, hand Sarah the gift of bells. He had seen Ethan, wild and untamable, listen to her guidance with respect. These were things he could not command. For Sarah, the twins became a bridge between what she had lost and what remained. She would return home after their lessons and sit on her porch as the dusk settled. The wind would stir the chimes, mingling their delicate sound with the faint jingling of bicycle bells still echoing in her memory. Tears often filled her eyes, for she knew that her own children would never again ring their bells in joy. But alongside the sorrow came a fragile gratitude. The chance to guide Emma and Ethan gave her purpose, a reason to step out of her silence, and into the sunlight again. The neighborhood began to notice. Some whispered that Sarah was living through the Miller children, that she was trying to replace what she had lost. Others shook their heads at David, speculating that a man of such wealth could not manage the simplest duties of fatherhood. The gossip reached him, carried by colleagues and acquaintances, who meant no harm but spoke with careless tongues. Each remark struck like a blow, though he concealed his reaction behind a mask of indifference. One evening, he entered the children's playroom and found them drawing. Emma's page was filled with flowers and bicycles, with a smiling figure in a blue dress. Ethan's page showed himself racing across the lawn, his hair wild, a figure behind him steadying his bike. Neither drawing included their father. David stood silently in the doorway, staring at the absence of his own image. The realization stung more deeply than he expected. Days passed, and the rivalry in his heart grew sharper. He could not bear the thought that his children turned instinctively to another, for comfort, for encouragement, for joy. And yet he could not deny what was plain. Sarah gave them something he could not. The tightness in his chest was not only jealousy, but shame, for he began to suspect that the problem was not her intrusion, but his absence. Sarah herself felt the tension. She noticed the way David looked at her when their paths crossed, the curt nods, the cool silence. She knew she was treading a delicate line, but she also knew the children needed what she offered. She told herself that she was doing it for them, not for herself, not to soothe her grief. Yet in quiet moments, when she heard the bells ringing and saw the children's joy, she admitted that teaching them also healed her, giving her heart a reason to beat again. The contrast between David's world and Sarah's could not have been sharper. His mansion gleamed with perfection, yet felt lifeless. Her home was worn and scarred, yet hummed with memory and the possibility of rebirth. Emma and Ethan, without knowing it, carried pieces of both worlds, the discipline of their father and the freedom of their neighbor. Each ride across the driveway, each wobble corrected, each bell that rang carried them further from the shadow of their father's control and closer to the warmth of Sarah's resilience. One night, David sat in his office staring at a spreadsheet that refused to hold his attention. His mind kept drifting to the image of Sarah kneeling beside Emma, whispering encouragement, her hand steady on the handlebars. He thought of Ethan laughing as Sarah clapped her hands in triumph. He remembered Emma's small gesture of giving her the bells, a child's offering of love. His fingers tightened on the arm of his chair. He wanted to be the one they trusted, the one they looked to with such devotion. But he could not erase what was plain. His children had found in Sarah the presence he had never offered. The bells rang again in his imagination as the night stretched on, each chime a reminder of both his failure and the fragile hope that perhaps it was not too late to change. But he did not yet know how. For now, all he felt was the growing weight of envy and the shadow of loss that did not belong only to Sarah, but to himself as well. And so, the days continued, each one deepening the contrast, each one drawing him closer to an unspoken truth. The problem was not that Sarah had stepped into his children's lives. The problem was that he had left a space empty long before she ever arrived. The summer festival arrived on a bright Saturday afternoon, transforming the city park into a sea of color and sound. Tents lined the grass, each offering food or games, while banners fluttered overhead and music drifted from the main stage. Families gathered in the open spaces, and children darted between booths with faces painted and balloons tied to their wrists. For most parents, it was a day to relax, but for David Miller, it was another chance to supervise his twins with the vigilance he believed essential. He had insisted on every precaution, helmets polished and fitted, reflective vests worn over their shirts, identification bracelets strapped firmly around their wrists. He reminded himself that he was not a careless father, that he would not risk their safety for even a moment. Yet beneath his watchful presence lay an unease that had been growing for weeks. Ever since Sarah Johnson had re-entered her own life by guiding his children on bicycles, David felt both displaced and unsure. His twins adored her, turning to her with questions and laughter in ways they rarely did with him. He had tried to counter this with rules, coaches, and expensive training, but each attempt had only driven a wider gulf between himself and his children. At the festival, the gulf seemed visible. Emma and Ethan pedaled in a small circle with the other children, their bells ringing in playful harmony. David stood at the edge, arms crossed, scanning the crowd like a general guarding a vulnerable flank. Sarah had also come, though not with the confidence of a parent. She lingered by the edge of the park, dressed simply in jeans and a light blouse, her eyes drawn instinctively to Emma and Ethan. Their laughter seemed to lift her, reminding her of her own children, whose voices she would never hear again. She carried the memory like a shadow, but in moments such as these, the shadow seemed lighter. When Emma looked toward her and waved, Sarah raised her hand in return, her heart aching and full at once. The air rang with the sound of dozens of bicycle bells. Children rode along a painted track marked by festival organizers, weaving through cones and over small ramps. Ethan, bold as always, pushed ahead, his face lit with determination. Emma followed cautiously, glancing back at her father for approval, though she received none. David's expression remained unreadable, his eyes flicking from one child to the next, his lips pressed in a firm line. He noticed Sarah watching, and his jaw tightened. He wanted to call the children back, to keep them close, to remove the influence of the woman who unsettled his authority. But the park was full, the crowd too thick, and their joy too evident to interrupt. Then, in a moment so simple it seemed harmless, Ethan's path curved toward the crowd. A butterfly, brilliant in its orange and black wings, fluttered across the track, catching the boy's attention. Without hesitation, he followed it, pedaling off the painted lines and into the flow of people. His small form disappeared quickly among taller bodies, and within seconds, he was gone. At first, David did not realize. He was watching Emma, who had slowed, wobbling slightly near the cones. He stepped forward, ready to steady her, when he noticed the empty space where Ethan should have been. His heart lurched. He scanned the track, the children circling, the parents cheering. Ethan was nowhere. Panic came in a rush, shattering the veneer of control. David shouted his son's name, his voice sharp and urgent, but the sound of the festival swallowed it whole. Music blared from the stage, vendors called to customers, and the air was filled with the cacophony of bells and laughter. Ethan could not hear his father's voice above it all, and even if he had, he was too far already. Emma looked up, sensing her father's alarm, She searched for her brother, her small face paling when she saw nothing. David turned wildly, pushing through the crowd, demanding if anyone had seen a boy on a red bicycle, blonde hair, 7 years old. Strangers shook their heads, startled by his intensity. A security guard noticed the commotion and hurried over, radioing for assistance. Within minutes, festival organizers and local police officers were scanning the grounds, spreading the description. Time stretched into an eternity. The longer Ethan remained unseen, the sharper David's fear became. His carefully built world of order meant nothing here. Money could not conjure his son from the chaos. For the first time in years, he felt utterly powerless. Sweat ran down his temples despite the mild weather, and his hands shook as he tried to explain to the officers how quickly Ethan had vanished. The words caught in his throat, tumbling out unevenly. Sarah, too, had noticed. She had seen the flash of the butterfly, the boy's eager pursuit, the way he pedaled away from the track. Her heart clenched with recognition, for her own children had once chased butterflies across a park just like this. Without hesitation, she left the edge of the crowd, moving swiftly, her eyes scanning every direction. Unlike David, she did not shout or panic. She searched with the quiet desperation of someone who knew too well how fragile a moment could be. Hours seemed to pass, though only minutes had slipped by. The search spread wider, down the park's paths, toward the pond at the far end. David's voice grew hoarse from calling, his chest tight with dread. He imagined the worst: an accident, a stranger, a loss that would mark him forever. His wealth, his influence, his power, none of it could shield him from the possibility that his son might not return. Then came a message over the police radio. A small boy had been found sitting near the pond. Relief surged through David with such force that his knees nearly gave way. He sprinted in the direction given, his expensive shoes sinking into the grass, his breath ragged. And there, on a wooden bench, sat Ethan. His bicycle lay beside him, and his eyes were fixed on the water where ducks glided peacefully. His cheeks were flushed, not with fear, but with excitement, as though he had discovered a secret world of his own. Sarah was already there, standing a short distance away, her expression both calm and heavy with emotion. She had been the one to spot him first, to recognize his small figure wandering contentedly by the pond. She had approached gently, guiding him to the bench, watching him with a mixture of relief and sorrow that only she could fully understand. David rushed forward, dropping to his knees in front of his son. Ethan looked up, surprised by the intensity of his father's embrace. The boy did not comprehend the panic he had caused. He signed with quick movements of his hands, explaining about the butterfly, about the ducks, about the adventure that had seemed so natural to him. David, still learning the language, understood only fragments, but the emotion was unmistakable. Ethan had not felt lost. He had felt free. The officers confirmed that he was safe, unharmed, and the search was called off. Parents who had gathered around dispersed, some murmuring about the scare, others casting glances at David with a mixture of pity and judgment. He felt their eyes on him, their unspoken questions about his fitness as a father. His chest burned with shame. That evening, the story spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some said Ethan had been neglected. Others whispered that Sarah had been too close, too involved, that she was inserting herself into the role of mother too easily. The gossip swirled, but David could not bring himself to care. All he could think of was the sight of his son alone by the pond, unreachable despite all the systems of control he had built. When they returned home, Emma clung to her brother, refusing to leave his side. Ethan spoke excitedly about his adventure, still unaware of the fear he had caused. David stood apart, his mind replaying the hours of absence, the helplessness he had felt, the image of Sarah guiding Ethan back to safety. He realized that the woman he had viewed as an intruder had been the one to restore what he could not find. For the first time, gratitude pierced his resentment. He did not speak it aloud, for pride held his tongue, but deep within he knew the truth. Sarah had saved more than his son that day. She had exposed the fragility of his control and shown him the cost of distance. The night settled heavy over the mansion, the silence no longer one of comfort, but of reckoning. David walked through the halls, past the children's rooms, past the office where his empire pulsed on screens, and paused at the window overlooking Sarah's house. Her porch light glowed faintly, and he imagined her sitting inside, staring at the bicycles that no longer rang with her children's laughter. He wondered how she could bear such loss, and why she still chose to give joy to his own children, despite the pain it must bring. In the stillness, David understood something he had never allowed himself to admit. He had built a fortress around his life, not only to keep danger out, but to keep grief at bay. Yet grief had entered anyway, through the spaces he had left unattended, through the children whose lives could not be controlled by wealth or walls. The bells of the festival still echoed in his mind, mingled now with the memory of the pond, the ducks, and Sarah's steady presence. The day had shown him the limits of his power, and though he resisted the lesson, he could not unlearn it. His children needed freedom as much as they needed safety, connection as much as they needed provision. And in Sarah's guidance, they had glimpsed a world he had denied them. As he stood there in the darkened room, David realized that change was no longer optional. It was already unfolding, carried forward by the ringing of bicycle bells, by the laughter of children, and by the quiet strength of a neighbor who had lost everything yet still managed to give. The night after Ethan's disappearance weighed heavily on David Miller. Though his son had been found unharmed and the house was quiet again, the echo of panic still throbbed in his veins. He had learned that all the safeguards in the world could not guarantee his children's safety, nor could they bridge the distance between them. The image of Sarah's steady presence by the pond lingered in his mind, a quiet rebuke to the fortress he had built around his life. As dawn broke and the first light spilled across the manicured lawn, he found himself wondering if the walls he had raised had not only shut out danger, but also love. The days that followed were marked by a subtle shift. Emma and Ethan, though happy to be home, carried the memory of their adventure into every corner of the house. They spoke of ducks, of butterflies, of the thrill of riding further than they had ever dared. Their excitement was edged with a confidence that unsettled David. He wanted to believe that his presence alone could give them courage, but the truth was harder. They had found their freedom under Sarah's guidance. He could no longer ignore the simple fact that she had given them something he had withheld. For Sarah, the episode had stirred wounds she thought she had buried. When she had spotted Ethan by the pond, her heart had trembled with the fear of recognition, the ache of déjà vu. She had seen her own boys in him, had felt again the sharp terror of searching for children who would never come home. Yet guiding him back to safety had also reminded her that her love for children had not died with her twins. It was a love she could still share, even if it came at the cost of reopening her grief. David watched her with new eyes. Where once he had seen intrusion, he now began to see resilience. He noticed the way she knelt to Emma's level when offering encouragement, how she allowed Ethan to stumble without rushing to rescue him, teaching him instead to rise again. He realized that he had mistaken control for care, that his refusal to let them fall had only deepened their fear. The realization was bitter, for it forced him to confront years of absence, of love measured in wealth rather than presence. The turning point came one Sunday afternoon when Sarah invited the neighborhood children to gather in her yard. She had decided, quietly and without fanfare, to begin teaching them to ride. The once silent bicycles leaned against the fence were cleaned and oiled, their bells polished until they shone in the sun. Emma and Ethan were the first to arrive, their voices bright with excitement. Soon, other children joined, and the yard was filled with ringing bells and laughter. David stood at the edge of the scene, unsure if he was welcome. But Emma beckoned him forward, her eyes shining with a plea he could not refuse. He approached hesitantly, his expensive shoes sinking into the grass, his hands awkward at his sides. Sarah glanced at him, a flicker of surprise crossing her face, but she said nothing. Instead, she guided Emma to her bicycle, her steady hand resting on the seat. In that moment, David understood what was required of him. Not control, not perfection, not the illusion of safety, but trust. He stepped forward, gently placing his hand on the back of Emma's bicycle. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, and for the first time he felt the weight of her faith. He began to jog alongside her, his grip firm but gentle, his breath quickening as the wheels gained speed. She wobbled, steadied, and with a burst of courage, he let go. The sight was unlike anything he had known. Emma pedaled forward, unassisted, her hair streaming behind her, the bell on her handlebars ringing clear and triumphant. She laughed, a sound so free that it pierced his chest with both joy and sorrow. He had been holding her back all this time, mistaking his fear for protection. Now, in the simple act of letting go, he saw her soar. Sarah watched with tears in her eyes. For her, the moment was a bittersweet vision of what her own children had never reached. Yet she felt no jealousy, only gratitude that she could witness it, that life could still bring beauty through another family. She knew that Emma and Ethan would carry this moment into their futures, just as she would carry the memory of her twins. The echoes of her loss would never fade, but they were softened now by the sound of bells ringing in triumph rather than silence. David did not stop there. In the weeks that followed, he allowed himself to be reshaped by what he had learned. He came home earlier from work, set aside his phone at dinner, and walked with his children through the neighborhood instead of sending them with staff. The conversations were clumsy at first, his attempts at connection awkward. But slowly, the distance narrowed. He discovered that his children's laughter did not need to be earned through achievement, that their joy was not something to control, but to share. Sarah became more than a neighbor. She became a mentor, a friend, a reminder that love could endure even through loss. Her home, once a place of silence, grew lively again with the voices of neighborhood children who came to learn from her. What had been a graveyard of memory became a garden of renewal. The bicycles leaned against her fence were no longer relics of grief, but symbols of resilience, their bells ringing in harmony with those of Emma and Ethan. The community, once whispering in judgment, began to gather in her yard on weekends. Parents watched as their children learned balance and courage, as Sarah guided them with patience and warmth. David found himself among them, not as a distant observer, but as a father willing to stumble alongside his children. The man who had once ruled through control now ran behind bicycles, laughing breathlessly, clapping when his children found their balance. Months later, David took a step that would have once been unthinkable. He offered to fund the creation of a small riding school in the neighborhood, a place where Sarah could teach not only bicycles, but resilience itself. He named it the Balance School, not for the mechanics of riding, but for the lesson that life itself demanded equilibrium between fear and freedom, control and trust, grief and hope. Sarah accepted with humility, her eyes glistening with the knowledge that her twins' legacy had found a new form. On the day the school opened, dozens of children gathered in the courtyard, their bells ringing in anticipation. Parents stood nearby, watching with pride as their children mounted bicycles and wobbled into motion. David stood at the front, Emma and Ethan at his side, his heart full as he listened to the chorus of bells. For the first time in years, he felt no need to calculate risk or enforce order. He felt only gratitude that his children had taught him what no boardroom ever could. That love was not a matter of control, but of presence. As the sun set that evening, David walked home with Emma and Ethan, their small hands in his. The air was filled with the fading sound of bells, carried on the breeze like a hymn. He thought of Sarah, of her courage, of the strength it took to give joy despite sorrow. He thought of his children, of their trust, of the day Emma had pedaled away from his hand and into her own freedom. And he thought of himself, no longer the man who clung to control, but a father learning at last to let go. The mansion that once stood silent now rang with laughter. The halls echoed with footsteps, with voices, with life. The emptiness that had once defined the Miller household was replaced by a fullness that could not be measured in wealth. It was measured instead in bicycle bells, in children's smiles, in the quiet knowledge that grief could be transformed into hope. And so, the story of loss and control became one of renewal and trust. Sarah, who had lost her twins, found healing in giving. David, who had nearly lost his children to distance, found redemption in presence. Emma and Ethan, once caught between fear and freedom, learned to ride not only their bicycles, but the uncertain path of life itself. On warm evenings, when the neighborhood gathered and the bells rang in chorus, David often stood behind his children, not leading, not pushing, but walking a step behind. He understood now that his place was not at the front, commanding their path, but alongside them, ready to catch them if they fell, proud to watch them rise when they did not. It was in that place, in the act of letting go, that he finally became what he had always longed to be, their father. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.